The snow was falling harder now, coating the windows of the Celestial Peak restaurant in a layer of white that made the warm interior glow like a beacon against the Colorado darkness. Ava Sinclair wiped down table 12 for the third time, her movements automatic after 6 months of working double shifts at Aspen's most exclusive dining establishment. Her back ached, her feet screamed in protest against the non-slip shoes she couldn't afford to replace, and the fake smile she perfected for wealthy tourists felt like it might crack her face in half. Have you ever worked in a place where the tip from one table could cover your rent, but most nights you go home with barely enough for groceries? If you're watching this from a state where the cost of living keeps climbing while wages stay flat, you know exactly how Ava felt as she watched another group of millionaires debate whether to order the $70 Wagyu or the $85 lobster. At 26, Ava had never imagined she'd be grateful for a job that paid her barely enough to survive. 3 years ago, her life had been completely different. Her father, Richard Sinclair, had built a successful engineering consulting firm from nothing, and Ava had just graduated from Stanford with her MBA, ready to help expand the family business. Then everything fell apart in a matter of months. Contracts disappeared overnight, clients stopped returning calls, and mysterious lawsuits drained their legal reserves faster than her father could fight them. She pushed the memory away as she had learned to do, focusing instead on the reservation list clipped to her apron. For guests at table 18, arriving at 8:30 for what the hostess had marked as a business dinner. The kind of men who ordered the most expensive wine without looking at prices and left tips that could make or break her month. The restaurant's main dining room buzzed with the low murmur of conversations conducted in voices trained never to be overheard. Crystal glasses clinked against bone china, and the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers created the perfect backdrop for deals worth more money than most people would see in their lifetimes. Ava had become expert at reading the subtle signs that separated the merely wealthy from the truly powerful. It was in the way they carried themselves, the quality of their watches, and most importantly, how the staff responded to their presence. When the 4 men arrived at exactly 8:30, Ava knew immediately they fell into the latter category. Harrison Blackwood led the group, his silver hair perfectly styled and his charcoal suit clearly custom-tailored. She recognized him from the financial magazines that sometimes appeared in the staff break room. Behind him followed Mitchell Crane, younger but equally polished, his pale blue eyes already scanning the room with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to finding weakness and exploiting it. The third man, Dr. Garrett Ashford, moved with the measured pace of someone who had never been forced to hurry for anything in his life. His handshake with the hostess lasted exactly long enough to be polite without suggesting actual interest in her as a person. The fourth, Robert Sterling, checked his phone constantly, his fingers dancing over the screen with the urgency of someone managing multiple million-dollar decisions simultaneously. Ava smoothed her black skirt and approached their table, her trained smile sliding into place despite the exhaustion that made her bones feel like lead. Table 18 was positioned perfectly for privacy, tucked into an alcove that allowed for confidential conversation while maintaining a clear view of the restaurant's other patrons. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the warm professionalism that had kept her employed despite the constant turnover in restaurant staff. "Welcome to Celestial Peak. Can I start you with something from our wine selection tonight?" Harrison Blackwood looked up from his menu, and for a moment, something flickered across his features. Recognition, perhaps, though Ava couldn't imagine how they might have met. Her world these days consisted of the restaurant, her tiny studio apartment, and the community college where she was slowly working toward a teaching certificate, taking one class at a time as she could afford it. "Wine? Yes," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The 2015 Chateau Margaux. And we'll need a few minutes to review the menu." Ava nodded, calculating quickly in her head. The Chateau Margaux retailed for over $800 a bottle. Even with the restaurant's markup, they were looking at a wine purchase that represented more than she made in 2 months. She retreated to the wine cellar, trying to ignore the way her hands shook slightly as she located the bottle. When she returned, the 4 men had settled into their chairs with the casual confidence of people who had never questioned their right to occupy any space they chose. Their conversation paused as she approached, and she caught fragments that made no sense to her. acquisition schedules, regulatory approvals, offshore restructuring. The language of high finance that might as well have been spoken in a foreign tongue. The wine service took longer than usual, partly because of the bottle's value and partly because Harrison Blackwood seemed to be studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. When she finally finished pouring and stepped back, he spoke again. "What's your last name, dear?" The question caught her off guard. In 6 months of working at Celestial Peak, no customer had ever asked for personal information beyond what might be necessary to process a credit card or make a reservation. "Sinclair, sir," she replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the growing sense that something was very wrong about this interaction. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. All 4 men exchanged glances, and Mitchell Crane actually smiled, though there was nothing warm about the expression. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted prey. "Sinclair," Crane repeated, drawing out the syllables like he was tasting them. "Now that's interesting. Would that be related to Richard Sinclair, the engineering consultant who used to have that lovely office building downtown?" Ava's blood turned to ice. Her father's name in the mouth of this stranger felt like a violation, like watching someone rifle through her most private possessions. She struggled to maintain her composure, but something must have shown on her face because Dr. Ashford leaned forward with obvious pleasure. "Oh, it is, isn't it? How delightful. Tell me, dear, how is your father these days? Still in the consulting business, or has he moved on to other endeavors?" The cruelty in his tone was barely disguised, and Ava realized with growing horror that these men knew exactly what had happened to her father. They knew about the business collapse, the lawsuits, the mounting debt that had driven Richard Sinclair to put a gun to his head rather than face another day of watching everything he had built crumble around him. "My father passed away 3 years ago," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion building in her chest. Robert Sterling looked up from his phone for the first time since arriving. "Oh, how tragic. Natural causes, I hope?" The question was designed to wound, and it succeeded. Ava felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break down. "I should let you gentlemen review the menu," she managed, starting to step away from the table. "Actually," Harrison Blackwood said, his voice carrying a command that stopped her in her tracks, "we'd like to chat a bit more. You see, we knew your father quite well. Professionally speaking, of course." Ava turned back, though every instinct screamed at her to run. The other diners seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding at table 18, their own conversations and meals continuing undisturbed. She felt isolated, trapped in this bubble of malicious attention with nowhere to escape. "We were involved in some business dealings with Richard," Mitchell Crane continued, swirling the expensive wine in his glass like this was the most casual conversation in the world. "Brilliant man, really. Such a shame about what happened to his company." "What happened," Dr. Ashford added with false sympathy, "was entirely predictable. Your father was an excellent engineer, but a terrible businessman. He trusted the wrong people, made the wrong investments, and paid the price for his naivety." "That's not true," Ava said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Her father had been many things, but naive wasn't one of them. He had built his company from nothing, had earned the respect of clients and competitors alike through decades of honest work and innovative solutions. Robert Sterling laughed, a sound entirely devoid of humor. "Oh, but it is true, my dear. You see, we were the ones who orchestrated his downfall. Every lost contract, every frivolous lawsuit, every regulatory challenge that tied up his resources, they all traced back to us." The words hit her like physical blows. Ava felt the world tilt around her, the elegant restaurant spinning as she tried to process what she was hearing. These men, these wealthy, powerful men, were casually admitting to destroying her father's life and driving him to suicide. But why? She whispered, no longer caring about maintaining her professional facade. Harrison Blackwood set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. "Because we could. Because his company was sitting on contracts worth millions, and we wanted them. Because in our world, the strong survive and the weak get consumed. Your father was weak, and he paid the appropriate price." The casual cruelty of it took her breath away. They weren't even angry at her father, hadn't seen him as a threat or an enemy. He had simply been an obstacle to be removed, a business asset to be acquired through whatever means necessary. Mitchell Crane reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim tablet, his fingers dancing across the surface until he found what he was looking for. "Here," he said, turning the screen toward her. "These are the incorporation documents for Sinclair Engineering Solutions, filed on March 15, 2019. And here," he swiped to another screen, "are the asset transfer agreements dated March 30th of the same year. Everything your father built, transferred to Blackwood Holdings for a fraction of its true value." Ava stared at the documents, seeing her father's forged signature on papers that had signed away his life's work. The dates told the story clearly. 2 weeks between the filing of incorporation and the forced sale. 2 weeks during which these men had systematically destroyed everything Richard Sinclair had spent 30 years building. He never knew who was behind it, did he? Dr. Ashford asked with genuine curiosity. Even at the end, he thought it was just bad luck and poor judgment. How wonderfully ironic. The restaurant around them continued its elegant dance of wealth and privilege, crystals still clinking against china, conversations still flowing in measured tones. But at table 18, 4 men were casually discussing the methodical destruction of a human life, while the victim's daughter stood frozen in horror and rage. Robert Sterling checked his watch, a platinum piece that probably cost more than Ava's annual salary. "Well, this has been illuminating, but we should probably order dinner. The filet mignon, I think, and perhaps the lobster risotto for the table." "Actually," Mitchell Crane said with a smile that made Ava's skin crawl, "I don't think we'll be ordering anything tonight." He gestured to the untouched wine, the empty bread plates, the water glasses they had barely touched. The bill for their table would be over $1,200, money that Ava desperately needed, and that represented a significant portion of her monthly income. "We've decided this establishment doesn't meet our standards," Harrison Blackwood announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "The service has been unprofessional, and frankly, we question the background checks performed on the staff." Ava felt the walls closing in around her as she realized what was happening. They weren't just going to refuse payment. They were going to ensure she was fired, cutting off the only source of income that stood between her and complete destitution. "You can't do this," she said, her voice barely audible. "Oh, but we can," Dr. Ashford replied cheerfully. "You see, my dear, we don't just destroy businesses. We destroy the people who depend on those businesses. Your father learned that lesson, and now it's your turn." The 4 men stood in unison, their movements coordinated with the precision of people who had performed this particular cruelty many times before. Other diners were beginning to notice the disturbance, their conversations growing quieter as they sensed drama unfolding. "Tell your manager that the Sinclair girl has been harassing customers about personal family business," Robert Sterling said as they prepared to leave. "I'm sure he'll understand the liability issues involved in employing someone so emotionally unstable." Ava stood frozen as her world collapsed around her for the second time in 3 years. The loss of this job would mean eviction from her apartment, the end of her college classes, and quite possibly homelessness. She had no family left, no safety net, no resources to fall back on. These 4 men had destroyed her father, and now they were finishing what they had started by destroying her. As they moved toward the exit, Harrison Blackwood paused beside her one final time. "Your father's mistake," he said quietly, "was believing that hard work and integrity mattered more than power and connections. I hope you've learned from his example." The restaurant's warm glow suddenly felt oppressive, the elegant surroundings transformed into a stage for her public humiliation. Ava watched the 4 men walk away, their expensive shoes silent on the restaurant's polished floors, and felt something inside her break completely. She was alone, defenseless, and utterly at the mercy of people who viewed her suffering as nothing more than an amusing diversion from their evening's entertainment. The silence that followed Harrison Blackwood's parting words stretched for exactly 13 seconds before it was shattered by the opening of the restaurant's main entrance. The sound of the heavy oak door closing echoed through the dining room with unusual force, as if whoever had entered possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. Ava looked up from her frozen position beside table 18, her vision still blurred with unshed tears, and felt her heart stop completely. The man standing in the entrance wore a black wool coat that emphasized his imposing frame, snowflakes melting on shoulders that seemed broad enough to block out the world. His dark hair was longer than she remembered, touching the collar of his coat, and 3 years had added lines around his steel-gray eyes that spoke of experiences she couldn't begin to imagine. Nikolai Volkov surveyed the restaurant with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to cataloging threats and exits within seconds of entering any space. His gaze moved across the room with predatory precision before settling on the four men who had frozen halfway to the exit like deer caught in headlights. The transformation in Harrison Blackwood was immediate and complete. The confident businessman who had spent the last 20 minutes casually describing the destruction of a man's life now stood rigid with fear, his face pale beneath his expensive tan. Mitchell Crane's hand had moved instinctively toward his jacket, a gesture that suggested familiarity with concealed weapons, while Dr. Ashford gripped his tablet so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Robert Sterling, who had been checking his phone with obsessive frequency all evening, now held it like a lifeline, his thumb hovering over what Ava assumed was an emergency contact. Nikolai moved through the restaurant with fluid grace, his footsteps silent on the polished floors despite his obvious size and weight. Other diners seemed to sense something dangerous in his presence, their conversations faltering as he passed their tables. The ambient jazz that had been providing elegant background music suddenly seemed inappropriately cheerful, like a soundtrack playing for the wrong movie. He stopped 3 feet from table 18, close enough that Ava could smell his cologne, a dark, expensive scent that brought back memories she had spent 3 years trying to bury. His presence filled the space around them like a physical force, transforming the elegant restaurant into something that felt more like a battlefield. "Gentlemen," Nikolai said, his voice carrying a slight Russian accent that became more pronounced when he was angry, though his tone remained perfectly controlled. "I believe you were just leaving without settling your bill." Harrison Blackwood cleared his throat, attempting to project his earlier confidence, but succeeding only in revealing how thoroughly it had been shattered. "Mr. Volkov, what an unexpected surprise. We were just having dinner and decided the establishment didn't meet our standards." Nikolai's gray eyes moved to Ava, and she saw something flicker across his features that might have been pain or regret or some combination of emotions too complex to name. When he looked at her, the predatory stillness that surrounded him softened into something that resembled the man she had once known, the man she had loved with the desperate intensity of someone who believed she had found her forever. "My fiancé," he said, the word falling into the restaurant's silence like a stone dropped into still water, "has been working very hard tonight to provide you with excellent service. I would hate for her efforts to go unrewarded." Ava felt her world tilt on its axis for the second time in 30 minutes. "Fiancé." The word echoed in her mind as she tried to process what was happening. 3 years of silence. 3 years of wondering if he was alive or dead. 3 years of rebuilding her life from the ashes of everything she had lost. And now he stood beside her claiming ownership with casual authority. Mitchell Crane had found his voice, though it came out rougher than usual. "Your fiancé? I had no idea you were engaged, Volkov. Congratulations." The threat implicit in Nikolai's presence had not diminished, but now it was layered with something even more dangerous. Possessiveness. The kind of territorial claim that suggested violence would follow any challenge to his declared ownership. "Thank you," Nikolai replied, his tone suggesting anything but gratitude. "Ava and I have been together for some time now. I apologize that I wasn't here earlier to introduce myself properly." He reached into his coat with a movement so fluid and controlled that it somehow managed to be both casual and threatening simultaneously. The four men tensed visibly, clearly familiar enough with violence to recognize the gesture of someone accessing a weapon. Instead, Nikolai produced a black leather wallet and withdrew a stack of bills thick enough to settle the table's outstanding charges 3 times over. "For the wine," he said, placing $500 bills on the table with deliberate precision. "And for any inconvenience these gentlemen may have caused the staff." The money sat on the white tablecloth like an accusation. More cash than Ava had seen in months, casually dispensed to resolve a situation that had threatened to destroy what remained of her carefully constructed survival. Dr. Ashford attempted to salvage some dignity from the encounter. "Really, Volkov, this is unnecessary." We were simply having a conversation about business matters. Nikolai's attention focused on him with laser intensity, and Ashford actually took a step backward under the weight of that gaze. Business matters, he repeated thoughtfully. How interesting. I also have business interests, particularly in ensuring that my fiancé's workplace remains a comfortable environment for her. Robert Sterling's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it reflexively before looking back up at Nikolai. We should probably be going, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Early morning meetings tomorrow. Of course, Nikolai agreed pleasantly. But before you leave, perhaps we should discuss the business matter you mentioned. The conversation you were having with Ava about her father's company. The four men exchanged glances that spoke of shared guilt and growing fear. They had revealed their crimes with casual arrogance to someone they viewed as powerless and isolated. Now they faced the possibility that their confessions had been overheard by someone with both the resources and inclination to act on the information. Harrison Blackwood attempted to regain control of the situation. I'm not sure what you think you heard, but our conversation was purely theoretical. Historical analysis of market conditions, nothing more. Nikolai smiled, and Ava felt a chill run down her spine at the expression. It was the smile of a predator who had cornered his prey and was savoring the moment before the kill. She had seen that smile once before, directed at men who had threatened her safety during the brief months they had been together. It had not ended well for those men. Historical analysis, Nikolai repeated, as if tasting the words and finding them amusing. How academic of you. I'm sure Ava appreciates your scholarly interest in her father's business ventures. He moved closer to the four men, his approach casual but unmistakably predatory. They found themselves backing toward the restaurant's entrance without conscious decision, their bodies responding to an ancient instinct that recognized superior danger. I think we've covered enough history for one evening, Nikolai continued. Perhaps we can continue this conversation another time, when we have more privacy to discuss the details of your theoretical analysis. Mitchell Crane's hand had moved closer to his jacket again, but he seemed to recognize the futility of the gesture. Whatever weapon he might be carrying would be useless against someone who moved with Nikolai's evident confidence and experience. We'll be in touch, Harrison Blackwood said, attempting to project authority even as he continued his retreat toward the exit. I'm certain you will, Nikolai replied. I look forward to our next meeting. The four men reached the entrance and practically fled into the Colorado night, leaving behind the expensive wine, the cash on the table, and the lingering sense that they had escaped something far worse than financial loss. The restaurant's atmosphere began to return to normal as other diners resumed their conversations, though many continued to glance toward table 18 with obvious curiosity. The drama was over, but the questions it had raised hung in the air like smoke. Nikolai turned to Ava, and suddenly the dangerous stranger who had faced down four powerful men transformed back into someone she recognized. Someone whose absence had left a hole in her chest that 3 years had failed to heal. Hello, Ava, he said quietly, his voice carrying an intimacy that made her heart race despite everything that had happened between them. Hello, Nikolai, she managed, surprised that she could speak at all. The name felt strange on her lips after so much silence, like a word from a language she had forgotten how to speak. We need to talk, he said, glancing around the restaurant with the same predatory awareness he had displayed when entering. But not here. Too many eyes, too many years. Ava looked at the money still sitting on the table, at the wine glasses that bore traces of lips that had casually described her father's murder, at the elegant surroundings that had become the stage for her second destruction and unexpected salvation. I can't leave, she said, though part of her wanted nothing more than to follow him anywhere that felt safe. My shift doesn't end until midnight, and after what just happened, I need this job more than ever. Nikolai's expression softened, and she caught a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had held her while she cried about meaningless problems that seemed laughably small compared to what she faced now. You don't need this job anymore, he said with quiet certainty. You don't need to serve wine to men who destroyed your family and then mock you for their entertainment. You're coming with me. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't quite a command either. It was the statement of someone who had made a decision and expected compliance, but who would listen if she chose to argue. Ava felt the weight of 3 years of struggle, 3 years of working jobs that barely kept her alive, while pursuing an education that might someday allow her to build something better. 3 years of careful independence and hard-won self-reliance that could disappear the moment she agreed to depend on someone else again. But she also felt the exhaustion that went bone deep, the knowledge that the men who had just left would find ways to destroy this job, and the next one, and the one after that. They had admitted their crimes with the confidence of people who believed themselves untouchable, and her presence in their world represented an unacceptable risk to their continued freedom. "Where have you been?" she asked, the question emerging with 3 years of pain and confusion behind it. Nikolai's jaw tightened, and she saw shadows move across his features like clouds blocking the sun. "Staying away from you," he said simply. "Keeping you safe from people who would have used you to hurt me." The answer raised more questions than it answered, but Ava could see in his eyes that this wasn't the place for the conversation they needed to have. The restaurant buzzed around them, elegant and civilized on the surface, while concealing currents of violence and betrayal that ran deeper than she had ever imagined. "My car is outside," Nikolai said, extending his hand toward her with the same careful courtesy he had shown during their brief courtship. "Will you trust me for one more night?" Ava looked at his outstretched hand, at the calluses that suggested he had learned to use violence as a tool, at the expensive watch that indicated his circumstances had improved considerably during their separation. She thought about her empty apartment, her dwindling savings, her uncertain future in a world where powerful men could destroy lives for entertainment. She thought about her father, who had trusted the wrong people and paid with everything he had built. She thought about the 4 men who had walked away tonight confident that there would be no consequences for their cruelty. And she thought about the way Nikolai had looked at those men, with the cold promise of retribution that suggested some people's confidence might be misplaced. "One night," she agreed, placing her hand in his, and feeling the warmth of connection she had convinced herself she would never experience again. Nikolai's fingers closed around hers with gentle strength, and she felt some of the fear and desperation that had been her constant companions begin to ease for the first time in years. "No one hurts what's mine," he said quietly, the words carrying a promise that was both comforting and terrifying in its implications. "Not anymore." As they walked toward the restaurant's entrance together, Ava caught her reflection in the window glass and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. 3 years of struggle and survival had changed her, but perhaps not as much as the next few hours would. Nikolai's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building that commanded views of the entire Aspen Valley, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering glimpses of snow-covered peaks that seemed to glow silver under the moonlight. The space was elegant but understated, decorated in dark woods and leather that suggested wealth without ostentation. Ava stood in the center of the living room, still wearing her restaurant uniform, feeling completely out of place in surroundings that spoke of a life she had never imagined him living. The silence between them stretched as they both struggled with the weight of 3 years' worth of unspoken words. Ava found herself cataloging the changes in him, the way his shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there before, the subtle scars on his hands that suggested experiences she didn't want to contemplate. He moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing tea with movements that were almost ritualistic in their precision. "You disappeared," she said finally, the words emerging with a flatness that didn't begin to capture the devastation his absence had caused. "One day you were there, talking about meeting my father, about finding a place together. The next morning you were gone, and I never heard from you again." Nikolai's hand stilled on the tea kettle, and she saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the handle. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested those 3 years had been as difficult for him as they had been for her. "I got a phone call at 4 in the morning," he said, still facing away from her. 3 men had been asking questions about you. Detailed questions about your schedule, your friends, your family. They wanted to know if you mattered to me, if hurting you would cause me pain." The words hit her like physical blows, and Ava felt her legs weaken enough that she had to sit down on his leather sofa. She had spent 3 years believing that their relationship hadn't meant enough to him to sustain his interest, that she had been nothing more than a temporary diversion for someone whose world operated on a completely different level than hers. "Who were they?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. "Business rivals," Nikolai replied, turning to face her with eyes that held 3 years' worth of regret. Men who understood that the fastest way to hurt someone is through the people they love. Men who would have used you as leverage against me without hesitation. The tea kettle whistled, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment. Nikolai moved to prepare their drinks with the same methodical care he had shown in the restaurant, as if normal domestic activities could somehow bridge the chasm that had opened between them. "So you just left?" Ava said, anger beginning to replace the initial shock. "You decided what was best for me without giving me a choice in the matter. You let me think you didn't care, let me believe I meant nothing to you." Nikolai brought her the tea, his fingers brushing hers as she accepted the cup. The contact sent electricity through her system, a reminder of the connection that had never really died despite years of deliberate separation. "If I had stayed, you would be dead," he said with quiet certainty. "Or worse. These men don't make empty threats, Ava. They follow through on their promises, and they're creative in their methods." "But you watched me," she accused, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed beginning to fall into place. "Tonight, when those men mentioned my father's company, you already knew. You've been keeping track of what happened to me." Nikolai sat across from her, maintaining enough distance to be respectful, while close enough that she could see the pain in his eyes. "I had people make sure you were safe," he admitted. "When your father's business collapsed, when he died, when you had to leave college and start working, I knew about all of it." The admission hit her harder than his initial departure had. To know that he had been aware of her suffering, had watched her struggle to survive while maintaining his distance, felt like a betrayal that went deeper than simple abandonment. "You watched me lose everything," she said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to maintain control. "You knew what those men did to my father, and you did nothing to help." Nikolai leaned forward, his own composure finally cracking enough to let real emotion show through. "If I had intervened, they would have known you mattered to me. Every action I took to help you would have painted a target on your back that I couldn't remove." "Then why now?" Ava demanded. "What changed tonight that made it safe to suddenly claim me as your fiancé in front of those same men?" "Because tonight they crossed a line they can't uncross," Nikolai said grimly. "Tonight they revealed themselves to you directly, which means they've already decided you're a threat that needs to be eliminated. My protection was the only thing standing between you and a very permanent solution to their problem." The words chilled her more than the Colorado winter wind that rattled the penthouse windows. She had been so focused on the humiliation and financial threat that she hadn't considered the physical danger implicit in their casual admission of murder and fraud. Nikolai moved to a desk in the corner of the room and returned with a tablet and several manila folders thick with documents. "The business matter they mentioned tonight, your father's company, it wasn't an isolated incident. Harrison Blackwood and his associates have been systematically destroying family businesses for over a decade." He opened the first folder and spread photographs and financial documents across the coffee table between them. Company logos she didn't recognize, incorporation papers, asset transfer agreements, and newspaper clippings that told stories of sudden business failures and unexplained suicides. 23 companies, Nikolai said, his voice taking on the clinical tone of someone delivering a briefing. Family operations built over generations, destroyed in a matter of months through coordinated legal attacks, regulatory challenges, and strategic contract interference. Ava picked up one of the newspaper clippings, a small article from a Denver business journal about the suicide of a construction company owner named Thomas Chun. The photo showed a man roughly her father's age, standing proudly in front of a building project that would never be completed. "How many people died?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. 11 confirmed suicides, Nikolai replied. 3 more deaths that were ruled accidental but occurred during the business collapse timeline. Dozens of families destroyed financially, hundreds of employees who lost their livelihoods when the companies were gutted and sold for parts. The scope of it overwhelmed her. She had thought her father's destruction was personal, the result of bad judgment or unfortunate circumstances. To learn that it was part of a systematic campaign of economic terrorism made her feel sick with rage and helplessness. "Why hasn't anyone stopped them?" she asked. "With this much evidence, surely law enforcement would investigate." Nikolai's expression grew darker. "Because they're very careful about covering their tracks. The actual destruction is carried out through shell companies and intermediary law firms. The paperwork is complex enough that proving conspiracy requires resources most victims don't have, and the survivors are usually too financially devastated to fund lengthy legal challenges. He opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be financial records and correspondence. But tonight they made a mistake. They admitted their crimes directly to a witness, and they did it in the presence of someone with the resources to act on that information. Ava studied the documents spread across the table, trying to process the magnitude of what she was seeing. Her father's death wasn't an isolated tragedy, but part of a pattern of systematic murder disguised as business acquisition. What did they do to him specifically? She asked, steeling herself for details she had never been able to uncover on her own. Nikolai pulled out a specific file, thicker than the others and marked with her father's name in neat handwriting. They started by bribing a regulatory official to challenge his environmental compliance certifications. Every project got tied up in legal challenges that drained his legal reserve funds. He showed her copies of documents she had never seen before, official letters questioning her father's work that had arrived daily during his final months. While he was fighting those challenges, they arranged for 3 of his biggest clients to break their contracts simultaneously, citing concerns about regulatory status. The timeline was brutally efficient. Within 60 days, Richard Sinclair Engineering had gone from a thriving consultancy to a company hemorrhaging money while fighting legal battles on multiple fronts. The final blow had come when his business partner, a man he had trusted for 15 years, had sold his stake to Blackwood Holdings for a fraction of its value. Dad never knew Marcus betrayed him, Ava whispered, reading through correspondence that painted her father's final weeks in heartbreaking detail. He kept trying to fix things, kept believing it was all just bad luck and timing. That's what made him vulnerable, Nikolai said gently. He couldn't conceive of the level of coordinated malice he was facing. He kept trying to solve problems through honest work and legal channels while his enemies used every illegal advantage they could access. Ava found herself crying for the first time since her father's funeral, tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed during the years of survival that followed. But these weren't just tears of grief anymore. They were tears of rage for a good man who had been destroyed by people who viewed his life as nothing more than a business obstacle. Nikolai moved to sit beside her on the sofa, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to presume too much intimacy too quickly. His presence was solid and warm, a reminder of safety and strength she had forgotten she could access. "We can stop them," he said quietly. "Tonight gave us evidence that no amount of careful planning can overcome. Direct confession to multiple crimes, recorded through the restaurant's security system I had installed last month when I learned you worked there." Ava looked up at him through her tears, hope and suspicion warring in her chest. "You had surveillance installed at my workplace?" "I had surveillance installed everywhere you spent time," he admitted without apology. "Coffee shops, the college, your apartment building, the bus routes you used. I needed to know if anyone was watching you, if anyone meant you harm." The revelation should have felt like a violation, but instead it filled her with a complex mixture of gratitude and longing. For 3 years, she had felt completely alone in the world, abandoned by everyone who might have cared about her well-being. To learn that someone had been watching over her, protecting her from dangers she hadn't even known existed, touched something deep inside her that had been frozen since his departure. "So what happens now?" she asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Now we destroy them the way they destroyed your father and 22 other families," Nikolai said, his voice carrying the promise of retribution she had heard in the restaurant. "But we do it legally, systematically, and completely. No quick death in the snow for these men. They're going to live to see everything they built taken apart piece by piece." He gathered the documents back into organized piles, his movements efficient and purposeful. Federal prosecutors have been looking for a way to build a conspiracy case against Blackwood Holdings for 2 years. Tonight's confession, combined with the documentary evidence I've been collecting, gives them everything they need. Ava felt something shift inside her, a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. For 3 years, she had been focused solely on survival, on getting through each day with enough money for food and shelter. The possibility of actual justice, of making the men who had destroyed her family pay for their crimes, felt like waking up from a nightmare into a world where right and wrong still mattered. "I want to help," she said, the words emerging with conviction that surprised her. It will be dangerous, Nikolai warned. Once we move against them, they'll know you're involved. There won't be any more hiding, any more anonymity. They'll come after both of us with everything they have. Ava looked around the penthouse, at the life of luxury and security that could be hers if she simply accepted his protection and stayed safely in the background while he handled everything. 3 years ago, she might have been tempted by the offer of someone else taking responsibility for the hard choices. But 3 years of working multiple jobs, of budgeting every dollar, of building a life from nothing had given her strength she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't the same woman who had needed to be protected from the world. She was someone who could stand up to powerful men in expensive suits and refuse to be intimidated. Good, she said firmly. Let them come. It's time someone fought back. Nikolai's expression shifted from concern to something that might have been pride mixed with hunger. The way he looked at her reminded her of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. The recognition of someone who saw her as an equal rather than something fragile that needed constant protection. Then we start tomorrow, he said, reaching for her hand with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious. And this time, we finish what they started. They spent the next 2 hours on Nikolai's laptop, reaching out to the families of other victims through carefully worded emails and encrypted phone calls. Each conversation followed a similar pattern of initial suspicion, gradual recognition, and overwhelming relief that someone finally believed their stories about systematic destruction disguised as market forces. Maria Santos, whose husband had owned a successful landscaping company in Phoenix, broke down crying when Ava explained that she wasn't alone, that the same group had targeted dozens of other families. The bankruptcy and suicide had happened 4 years ago, but Maria still blamed herself for not seeing the warning signs, for not being strong enough to help her husband fight back against forces she hadn't understood. David Chun, son of the construction company owner whose obituary Ava had seen earlier, provided details about the regulatory challenges that had destroyed his father's business virtually overnight. Environmental compliance issues that had never existed before, building permits suddenly revoked for technical violations that made no sense, insurance policies canceled due to anonymous complaints about safety violations. By midnight, they had documented testimony from 7 families and established a pattern so consistent it read like a business manual for organized economic terrorism. The same shell companies appeared in multiple cases, the same law firms filed the frivolous lawsuits, and the same regulatory officials signed off on compliance challenges that had no basis in actual law. Ava found herself energized by the work in a way she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. For 3 years, her days had been consumed with survival, with earning enough money to pay rent and buy groceries while slowly working toward a degree that might someday lead to a better life. This felt different. This felt like purpose. Nikolai had been watching her throughout the evening, and she caught him studying her with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the serious nature of their work. When she asked him about it, he smiled with something that looked like wonder. "You're magnificent when you're angry," he said, closing the laptop and giving her his full attention. "I always knew you had strength, but watching you channel your pain into something constructive, seeing you take control of a situation that could have destroyed you, it's remarkable." The compliment hit her more deeply than it should have, partly because she had spent so long feeling powerless and partly because his opinion had always mattered more to her than she had been willing to admit. During their brief relationship 3 years ago, she had been younger, more dependent on external validation, content to let him make the difficult decisions while she focused on safer pursuits like her MBA program. "I had good teachers," she said, thinking of the minimum wage jobs that had taught her to smile while being verbally abused by customers, the college courses she had taken one at a time while working double shifts, the bureaucratic battles she had fought alone when her father's insurance companies tried to deny his claims. Nikolai moved closer on the sofa, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. The investigative work had created an intimacy between them that had nothing to do with their romantic history and everything to do with shared purpose and mutual respect. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice taking on the serious tone he used when discussing matters of life and death. "What we're planning to do, exposing these men publicly, it's going to put you in danger that I can't completely control. They have resources, connections, and a demonstrated willingness to kill people who threatened their operation. Ava felt a flutter of fear in her stomach, but it was overwhelmed by something stronger: determination. For too long, she had been reactive, responding to threats and changes rather than taking control of her own destiny. The prospect of actually fighting back, of making the people who had destroyed her father face consequences for their actions, felt like the first real choice she had made in years. "I understand the risks," she said, meeting his gaze with steady conviction. "But I also understand what happens if we do nothing. They keep destroying families, keep driving good people to suicide, keep getting away with murder because their victims are too scared or too poor to fight back." Nikolai's expression shifted to something she recognized from their early relationship, the look he got when she surprised him with her courage or insight. It was attraction mixed with respect, the recognition of an equal rather than someone who needed constant protection. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Once we move against them, once we make this public, there won't be any more hiding what I am or what my world involves. You'll be associated with me permanently, and that comes with its own set of dangers and complications." Ava had been wondering about the specifics of his business for hours, noting the expensive apartment, the sophisticated surveillance network, the obvious familiarity with violence and intimidation. She had pieced together enough to understand that his world operated outside the boundaries of conventional law, but she found that the knowledge didn't frighten her the way it once might have. "What exactly do you do, Nikolai?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the general outline of the answer. "I solve problems for people who can't use traditional legal channels," he said with characteristic directness. "Business disputes that require persuasion beyond what lawyers can provide, debt collection when banks won't help, protection for people who've made enemies of the wrong kind of men." The admission should have changed everything between them, should have sent her running back to her small apartment and her safe but limited life. Instead, she felt a complex mixture of understanding and relief. His world was dangerous, but it was also a world where actions had consequences, where people like Harrison Blackwood couldn't hide behind lawyers and regulatory capture forever. "You're telling me you're essentially a criminal," she said, testing the words to see how they felt. "I'm telling you I'm someone who operates in the spaces between laws," Nikolai replied without apology. "Sometimes that means breaking rules that were designed to protect people like Blackwood from people like me." Ava considered this, thinking about the legal system that had failed to protect her father, the regulatory agencies that had been corrupted into weapons against honest businesses, the police who had classified his death as suicide and closed the case without investigating the systematic destruction that had led to it. "Maybe the world needs more people like you," she said finally. The words hung between them like a confession, an admission that she was choosing his version of justice over the legal system that had abandoned her family. It was a line she couldn't uncross, a decision that would fundamentally change who she was and what kind of life she could lead. Nikolai reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that felt both familiar and completely new. The touch sent electricity up her arm, a physical reminder of the connection that had never really disappeared despite 3 years of forced separation. "If we do this together," he said softly, "there's no going back to the life you had before. No more anonymity, no more safety in being overlooked. You become a target forever, and you become mine forever." The possessive declaration should have raised feminist alarm bells, should have triggered every warning about men who try to claim ownership of independent women. Instead, it filled her with a sense of safety and belonging she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. To be claimed by someone with the power to protect what he valued felt like coming home after years of exile. "I stopped being safe the moment those men recognized my name tonight," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. "At least this way, I'm choosing to fight instead of just trying to survive." Nikolai's other hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking across her skin with gentle reverence. The gesture was intimate enough to make her breath catch, familiar enough to bring back memories of quiet mornings and shared secrets from their brief time together. "I've missed you," he said, his accent becoming more pronounced as emotion roughened his voice. "Every day for 3 years, I've missed the way you think, the way you challenge me, the way you make me want to be worthy of your trust." The confession broke something loose inside her chest, some carefully maintained wall that had protected her from hoping for things she couldn't control. She had missed him too, more than she had allowed herself to acknowledge even in her most honest moments. His absence had left her feeling incomplete, as if part of her essential self had been amputated without anesthesia. "I thought you didn't want me," she whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her through every lonely night and difficult day. "I thought I wasn't important enough to fight for." Nikolai's expression grew fierce, and she saw something dangerous flicker in his gray eyes. "You were too important to risk," he said with quiet intensity. "Losing you would have destroyed me, but getting you killed would have been worse than death." The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning 3 years of misunderstanding and pain. Ava felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, but they were different from the tears she had shed earlier. These were tears of relief, of recognition, of finally understanding that his departure had been sacrifice rather than abandonment. She leaned into his touch, letting herself enjoy the warmth of his palm against her skin, the familiar scent of his cologne, the steady strength of his presence. For 3 years she had been completely alone, had made every decision and faced every challenge without support or partnership. The possibility of sharing those burdens felt like a gift she had stopped believing she deserved. "Show me," she said quietly, the words emerging with more courage than she had known she possessed. Nikolai's breath caught, and she saw surprise and hunger war across his features. "Show you what?" "That I still matter to you," she said, moving closer until there were only inches between them. "That this isn't just about protecting me or seeking justice for my father. Show me that you still want me for myself." His hand moved from her cheek into her hair, his fingers tangling in the dark strands with possessive gentleness. When he leaned forward to close the distance between them, she met him halfway, their lips connecting with 3 years of suppressed longing and carefully denied need. The kiss started gentle, almost tentative, as if they were both afraid of rushing something that had taken so long to rebuild. But the connection was immediate and overwhelming, their bodies remembering what their minds had tried to forget. Ava felt herself melting into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she pulled him closer, needing to confirm that he was real and present in hers again. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nikolai rested his forehead against hers with careful intimacy. "Mine," he said quietly, the single word carrying the weight of possession and protection and promise. "Yours," she agreed, the admission feeling both like surrender and victory. They spent the rest of the night planning their approach to the charity gala where Blackwood Holdings would be presenting a major donation to children's cancer research, the kind of public philanthropy that would make their eventual arrest particularly satisfying. By dawn, they had a strategy that would expose the conspiracy in front of the city's most influential citizens while providing federal prosecutors with everything they needed for airtight convictions. But more than that, they had rebuilt something that was stronger than what they had lost 3 years ago. Partnership, trust, love that had been tested by separation and emerged more powerful than before. As the first light of morning painted the mountain peaks silver and gold, Ava realized she was no longer the broken woman who had served wine to her father's killers 12 hours earlier. She was someone with purpose, with allies, with the power to fight back against forces that had seemed insurmountable when faced alone. Tomorrow night, Harrison Blackwood and his associates would learn that their victims weren't as helpless as they had believed. The first sign that Harrison Blackwood had decided to escalate came at 7 in the morning, exactly 12 hours after their confrontation at the restaurant. Nikolai's phone buzzed with an alert from his security system, surveillance cameras detecting 3 black SUVs parked outside the building that housed Ava's apartment. Professional surveillance, the kind that cost serious money and suggested serious intent. Ava was making coffee in his kitchen when he showed her the footage on his tablet, her movements still carrying the careful grace of someone unaccustomed to luxury but determined not to break anything expensive. She had slept in one of his shirts, the oversized garment making her look younger and more vulnerable than the fierce woman who had demanded justice the night before. "They found my apartment," she said, studying the image with surprising calm. "How long before they decide watching isn't enough?" Nikolai appreciated that she didn't waste time with denial or false optimism. 3 years of survival had taught her to assess threats realistically, to understand that powerful men didn't hire professional surveillance teams just to gather information. Today, probably, he replied, enlarging the image to get better detail on the license plates and facial recognition markers. These aren't local muscle. The equipment they're using, the coordination they're displaying, this is federal-level professional intimidation. The observation should have terrified her, but instead Ava seemed to grow more focused, her movements becoming precise and purposeful as she processed the threat. She had clearly learned to function under pressure, to channel fear into productive action rather than paralysis. "What's our timeline for the gala evidence presentation?" she asked, already thinking tactically about their options. 48 hours, Nikolai said. The federal prosecutor needs that long to coordinate with the SEC and FBI white-collar crime division. If we move too fast, some of the evidence gets ruled inadmissible due to improper procedure. Ava nodded, understanding the implication immediately. 48 hours was a long time to stay ahead of professionals who had resources and local connections. They would need to be smarter, faster, and more ruthless than teams trained specifically for this kind of operation. "Then we need to accelerate our evidence gathering," she said with quiet determination. "If they're moving to silence us, that means we're close to something they can't afford to have exposed." Nikolai's phone rang before he could respond, the caller ID showing a number he recognized with growing concern. Marcus Fleming, Richard Sinclair's former business partner, the man who had sold his stake to Blackwood Holdings and effectively signed Ava's father's death warrant. "It's him," Nikolai said, showing Ava the screen. "Your father's business partner." Ava's face went pale, then flushed with anger as she realized the significance. Marcus had been like family to her father, had attended her college graduation, had been trusted with decisions that affected their entire family's future. His betrayal had been the final blow that destroyed her father's will to fight. "Answer it," she said, her voice carrying a hardness he hadn't heard from her before. "Put it on speaker." Nikolai accepted the call and activated the speaker function, setting the phone on the kitchen counter where they could both hear clearly. "Volkov." Marcus Fleming's voice carried obvious stress, the kind of tension that suggested sleepless nights and mounting panic. "We need to talk. There are things about Richard Sinclair's situation that you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Nikolai replied, his tone giving nothing away. "You sold out your business partner for money and helped drive him to suicide. What else is there to know?" The line was quiet for several seconds, and when Marcus spoke again, his voice was strained with what might have been genuine remorse. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way. They told me they just wanted to acquire the company, that Richard would be offered a position with the new management structure." Ava's hands clenched into fists, her entire body radiating fury at hearing her father's betrayer attempt to justify his actions with lies about good intentions. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Nikolai pressed. "They destroyed him systematically, used every piece of inside information you provided to target his weaknesses and eliminate his ability to fight back." "Look," Marcus said, desperation creeping into his voice, "I've been getting calls since yesterday. Men asking questions about our conversation, wanting to know what I might have recorded, what evidence might still exist. They're not just threatening me anymore. They're threatening my family." The admission revealed a crucial piece of information. Marcus had recorded something, some conversation or confession that Blackwood Holdings considered dangerous enough to risk exposure through intimidation tactics. "What did you record?" Ava asked, speaking for the first time and causing Marcus to audibly gasp. "Jesus, is that Ava?" Marcus's voice cracked with emotion. "Ava, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to happen the way it did. Your father was a good man, a better man than I ever was." "What did you record?" she repeated, her voice like steel despite the obvious pain of speaking to the man who had destroyed her family. "The final meeting," Marcus admitted, "when Harrison Blackwood explained exactly what they planned to do to Richard if I didn't cooperate. He wanted me to understand the consequences of refusing their offer, so he was very specific about their methods." The revelation sent electricity through the air between Ava and Nikolai. A recording of Blackwood explicitly describing their systematic destruction methods would be the final piece of evidence needed to ensure conviction on conspiracy and murder charges. "Where is the recording now?" Nikolai asked. "Safe deposit box," Marcus said quickly. "But they know I have it. They've been pressuring me to hand it over, and their pressure is getting increasingly physical. I need protection, and I need it today." Nikolai looked at Ava, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her expression. Marcus Fleming was a traitor and a coward, but he was also their key to ensuring justice for her father and the 22 other families that had been destroyed. "We'll meet you," Ava said before Nikolai could respond. "But it has to be public, somewhere with witnesses and security cameras. And you bring the recording with you." "The Denver Art Museum," Marcus said immediately. "Main lobby, 2 o'clock this afternoon. There will be enough foot traffic to discourage any aggressive action, and the security is excellent." After ending the call, Nikolai and Ava spent an hour planning their approach to the meeting, considering every angle and potential trap. Marcus was clearly terrified, but that didn't necessarily mean he could be trusted. Desperate men made dangerous choices, and the pressure from Blackwood Holdings would be intense. They were still discussing contingency plans when Nikolai's security system triggered another alert. This time, the threat was immediate and local. 3 men in dark suits had entered his building through the parking garage, bypassing the security desk with credentials that suggested law enforcement or federal authority. "We need to leave," Nikolai said, already moving toward the bedroom where he kept emergency supplies and defensive equipment. Now, Ava followed without question, her trust in his judgment absolute despite the fact that she had no idea what kind of escape plan he might have prepared. She watched him retrieve items from a concealed safe built into the bedroom wall. Cash, identification documents, what appeared to be a compact pistol, and a small device that looked like a sophisticated communication system. "The building has a service elevator that connects to the parking garage of the building next door," he explained, leading her toward a door she had assumed was a closet. Emergency exit route that most people don't know exists. As they moved through the hidden passage, Ava felt adrenaline surge through her system, sharpening her focus and awareness to levels she had never experienced. This was real danger, immediate and physical, not the abstract threat of financial ruin or professional intimidation. Behind them, she could hear sounds that suggested the men had reached Nikolai's floor and were attempting to gain entry to his apartment. Whatever credentials they were using, they apparently didn't include actual legal authority to break down doors, which meant they were operating outside official channels. They emerged into the neighboring building's parking garage, where a dark sedan waited with the engine running. Nikolai had clearly planned for this contingency, though Ava suspected such planning was routine in his world rather than specific preparation for their current situation. As they drove through Denver's midday traffic toward the art museum, Ava found herself analyzing her own emotional state with detached curiosity. 24 hours earlier, she would have been paralyzed with terror at the prospect of armed men pursuing her through downtown Denver. Now she felt focused and determined, ready to fight rather than simply flee. "You're handling this remarkably well," Nikolai observed, apparently noting her calm demeanor despite the circumstances. "I've been afraid for 3 years," she replied, watching their rear-view mirror for signs of pursuit. "I'm tired of being afraid. These men killed my father and 22 other innocent people. If they want to silence me, they're going to have to work for it." Her transformation amazed him, and he could see it in the way he looked at her, with growing respect and something that might have been pride. The broken waitress from the restaurant had evolved into someone capable of standing beside him as an equal partner in dangerous enterprise. When they reached the art museum, Marcus Fleming was already waiting in the main lobby, a man in his 50s whose expensive suit couldn't disguise the obvious stress and exhaustion etched into his features. He clutched a briefcase like a lifeline, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd for potential threats. The exchange took less than 5 minutes. Marcus handed over a digital recorder containing 2 hours of conversation with Harrison Blackwood, detailed descriptions of systematic business destruction, explicit discussion of driving targeted owners to suicide, and casual references to 11 previous victims who had chosen death over financial ruin. In return, Nikolai provided Marcus with contact information for a federal witness protection program and enough cash to disappear until the arrests could be completed. It was more mercy than the man deserved, but Ava had insisted that breaking the cycle of destruction meant protecting even the people who had enabled it. That evening, as they prepared for the charity gala that would serve as the stage for exposing the conspiracy, Ava realized that her relationship with Nikolai had evolved beyond what they had shared 3 years earlier. This wasn't just romance rekindled through proximity and shared danger. This was partnership forged through mutual respect and common purpose. Tomorrow night, justice would finally be served for her father and all the other victims of Blackwood holding systematic cruelty. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Ava felt complete. She had found her purpose, her strength, and her place beside someone who valued her as an equal rather than something fragile that needed constant protection. The men who had destroyed her family were about to learn that some victims fight back, and some partnerships are strong enough to bring down empires built on the bones of the innocent. The Denver Children's Hospital Charity Gala was held at the Grand Hyatt's ballroom, a space designed to showcase wealth and philanthropy in equal measure. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables set with bone china and sterling silver, while Denver's elite mingled an evening where that cost more than most families spent on housing in a year. The irony wasn't lost on Ava that these same people would be witnessing the downfall of men who had destroyed families for profit while ostensibly supporting children's welfare. She stood beside Nikolai at the entrance to the ballroom, wearing a midnight blue gown he had selected that made her feel transformed from the exhausted waitress of 2 nights ago into someone who belonged in this world of power and influence. The dress fit her perfectly, elegant without being ostentatious, expensive enough to signal wealth without screaming desperation to belong. Federal agents were positioned throughout the venue, posing as servers, photographers, and even donors, their presence coordinated through earpieces that looked like standard security equipment. Agent Sarah Morrison, the lead prosecutor who had spent 2 years building the conspiracy case against Blackwood Holdings, had briefed them extensively on timing and positioning. Everything depended on presenting the evidence publicly before making arrests, ensuring that the conspiracy's exposure couldn't be suppressed through legal maneuvering or media manipulation. Harrison Blackwood held court at Table 1, positioned prominently near the stage where he would be presenting a $5 million donation to the hospital's cancer research program. The donation was funded entirely through money stolen from his victims, a fact that would be revealed along with everything else when the evidence presentation began. Mitchell Crane, Dr. Garrett Ashford, and Robert Sterling occupied seats at surrounding tables, their positions carefully arranged to create maximum visual impact when the arrests occurred. They appeared relaxed and confident, clearly believing that their intimidation tactics had neutralized any threat Ava and Nikolai might have represented. Marcus Fleming was notably absent, having entered witness protection the previous afternoon after his recorded confession had been authenticated and integrated into the federal case. His absence would be explained soon enough, though Ava suspected the 4 conspirators already understood what his disappearance meant for their carefully constructed empire. The evening's program began with the standard charity auction, wealthy donors competing to purchase artwork and experiences while congratulating themselves on their generosity. Ava watched the proceedings with growing anticipation and a strange sense of calm. After 3 years of powerlessness, after a lifetime of believing that justice was something that happened to other people, she was about to witness systematic evil receive systematic consequences. Nikolai's hand found hers under the white tablecloth, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that grounded her in the present moment. His touch reminded her that she wasn't facing this alone, that she had someone beside her who understood both the importance of justice and the cost of achieving it. When Harrison Blackwood took the stage to present his donation, his voice carried the practiced sincerity of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing philanthropic while destroying lives for profit. He spoke about the importance of supporting children's medical research, about the privilege of giving back to the community, about the responsibility that came with success. Ava felt rage build in her chest as she listened to him invoke the same values her father had lived by, the same commitment to helping others that had made Richard Sinclair vulnerable to the systematic destruction these men had orchestrated. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, and she could see similar anger reflected in the faces of other victims' family members scattered throughout the audience. Agent Morrison had positioned herself near the stage, wearing the dark suit and earpiece of venue security. When Blackwood concluded his prepared remarks and asked for questions from the audience, she stepped forward with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in high-stakes situations. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics. "I have some questions about the source of your donation tonight." The interruption created a ripple of confusion through the audience, donors exchanging glances as they tried to understand why security would be questioning a major philanthropist during his presentation. Blackwood himself seemed momentarily thrown, though he recovered quickly with the smooth professionalism of someone experienced in managing unexpected challenges. "I'm not sure I understand the question," he replied, his tone suggesting polite confusion rather than concern. Agent Morrison activated the ballroom's audiovisual system, connecting her tablet to the large screens positioned around the room for auction displays. The first image that appeared was a photograph of Richard Sinclair standing proudly in front of his engineering firm's headquarters, taken just 6 months before his death. "This is Richard Sinclair," she announced to the now silent audience. "He built a successful engineering consultancy over 30 years, employed 47 people, and contributed millions in tax revenue to our local economy. 3 years ago, his business was systematically destroyed through coordinated legal attacks, regulatory manipulation, and strategic contract interference." Ava felt her heart racing as her father's story was told to an audience that included many people who had known and respected him during his lifetime. She could see recognition dawning on faces throughout the ballroom, understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than standard charity gala entertainment. The next slide showed the incorporation documents for Sinclair Engineering Solutions, followed by the asset transfer agreements that had signed away her father's life work for a fraction of its value. The timeline was clear and damning. 2 weeks of systematic destruction culminating in forced sale to Blackwood Holdings. Mr. Sinclair took his own life rather than face bankruptcy and the loss of everything he had spent his lifetime building. Agent Morrison continued. What he never knew was that his destruction was planned and executed by the same men who profited from acquiring his assets. Harrison Blackwood's composed facade was beginning to crack, his face pale with the realization that his carefully constructed public image was being dismantled in front of Denver's most influential citizens. The other 3 conspirators were attempting to leave their tables discreetly, but found their paths blocked by federal agents who had moved into position around the ballroom. The audio recording that followed was the most damning evidence of all. Marcus Fleming's conversation with Harrison Blackwood played through the ballroom's sound system, the casual discussion of driving business owners to suicide filling the elegant space with horrible clarity. Blackwood's voice was unmistakable as he explained the systematic methods used to destroy targeted companies and eliminate their owners as business obstacles. "We want them desperate," Blackwood's recorded voice explained with clinical detachment. "Bankruptcy isn't enough because they might rebuild. We need them broken completely, willing to choose death over the humiliation of losing everything they've worked for." The audience's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps of horror, expressions of disgust, the sound of chairs scraping as people moved away from the conspirators' tables in physical revulsion. These were people who understood business competition, who accepted that fortunes were won and lost through strategic maneuvering, but systematic murder disguised as market forces crossed lines that even the most ruthless among them recognized as unacceptable. Agent Morrison continued the presentation, displaying evidence of 23 destroyed companies, 11 confirmed suicides, and financial records showing how the conspirators had profited from each systematic destruction. The scope and coordination of the conspiracy became clear as shell companies, corrupted regulatory officials, and coordinated legal attacks were traced back to their sources. Ava rose from her seat when her father's final days were described, when the timeline of his mounting desperation was laid out alongside the evidence of coordinated psychological torture designed to drive him to self-destruction. She had lived through those weeks, had watched her father struggle against forces he couldn't understand or fight, had seen him lose hope day by day as everything he had built crumbled around him. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the silent ballroom. 3 years of grief and rage channeled into words that would ensure her father's story was remembered accurately. "My name is Ava Sinclair," she said, her gaze fixed on Harrison Blackwood's pale face. "Richard Sinclair was my father, and these men murdered him as surely as if they had put a gun to his head. They destroyed 23 families for profit, drove 11 people to suicide for money, and celebrated their success while attending charity galas like this one. The silence that followed her words was complete, broken only by the sound of handcuffs clicking into place as federal agents moved to arrest the 4 conspirators. Harrison Blackwood, Mitchell Crane, Dr. Garrett Ashford, and Robert Sterling were led away in front of 300 witnesses, their expressions ranging from shocked disbelief to desperate fury as they realized that their carefully constructed empire was collapsing in the most public way possible. The arrests were coordinated with raids on their offices, homes, and financial institutions, ensuring that no evidence could be destroyed and no assets could be hidden offshore. The conspiracy they had built over more than a decade was being dismantled with the same systematic thoroughness they had used to destroy their victims. As the ballroom erupted into shocked conversation and media attention, Ava felt a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. Justice had been served not through vigilante revenge, but through legal process, public exposure, and systematic accountability. The men who had destroyed her family would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison, their wealth redistributed to compensate their victims. Nikolai found her in the chaos that followed, his arms encircling her with protective warmth as she processed the magnitude of what they had accomplished together. The exhausted waitress who had been humiliated 2 nights earlier had helped bring down a conspiracy that had operated with impunity for over a decade. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice carrying relief and satisfaction in equal measure. "No," Ava replied, looking around at the faces of other victims' family members who had witnessed their abusers finally face consequences. "It's just beginning." 6 months later, Ava stood in the offices of the Sinclair Foundation for Economic Justice, surrounded by case files and victim testimonies that filled 3 rooms of their downtown Denver headquarters. The foundation had been established using recovered assets from Blackwood Holdings. Its mission focused on providing legal support and financial assistance to families targeted by systematic business destruction. The work was demanding and often heartbreaking, requiring her to relive variations of her father's story through the experiences of dozens of other families. But it was also deeply satisfying, the first career she had ever pursued that felt like genuine purpose rather than simple survival. Maria Santos had been their first success story. Her late husband's landscaping company reconstituted and expanded using compensation funds and legal support from the foundation. David Chun had returned to college to finish the engineering degree his father's death had interrupted, his tuition paid through educational grants established in Richard Sinclair's name. Each victory was small in comparison to the scope of devastation the conspiracy had caused, but collectively they represented something larger. Proof that systematic evil could face systematic consequences, that victims weren't powerless if they had resources and support to fight back. Nikolai appeared in her office doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just concluded successful negotiations. His business had evolved since their partnership began, focusing increasingly on legitimate security consulting and decreasingly on the gray market problem-solving that had once defined his work. "The Henderson case is resolved," he announced, settling into the chair across from her desk. 3 years of legal fees recovered, business assets returned, and the responsible parties facing federal charges for conspiracy and fraud. Ava accepted the coffee gratefully, using the brief pause to study the man who had become both her business partner and life partner over the past 6 months. Their relationship had deepened through shared work and mutual respect, evolving into something stronger than what they had lost 3 years earlier. "That's 12 families fully compensated this month," she said, updating the spreadsheet that tracked their progress toward helping every victim of the Blackwood conspiracy. Only 11 more cases pending resolution. The foundation's success had attracted attention from federal agencies, legal aid organizations, and other advocacy groups working to address systematic business fraud. What had started as personal quest for justice had become a model for how victims could organize effectively to fight back against coordinated economic terrorism. Their wedding had been small and private, attended only by the victim families who had become their extended community and the federal agents who had helped bring the conspiracy to justice. Agent Morrison had served as Ava's maid of honor, joking that she had never before seen evidence presentation lead directly to romance. though she highly recommended the combination for future cases. The evening news played on the small television in Ava's office, providing updates on the ongoing trials of the Blackwood conspirators. Harrison Blackwood had been sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Mitchell Crane received 30 years, Dr. Ashford 28, and Robert Sterling 25 years, their sentences varying based on their level of participation in the conspiracy's most violent aspects. Marcus Fleming had served 8 months in minimum security prison after cooperating fully with federal investigators. His sentence reduced in exchange for testimony that had helped convict dozens of other participants in the systematic fraud operation. He had relocated to Oregon and started working with a legal aid organization focused on protecting small businesses from predatory acquisition tactics. Justice had been comprehensive and systematic, but Ava knew that the real victory lay in the Foundation's ongoing work and the community they had built among survivors. Her father's death had meaning now, had led to changes that would protect other families from experiencing the same systematic destruction. As the day's work concluded and they prepared to leave the office for dinner at their favorite restaurant, Ava reflected on the transformation her life had undergone since that night at the Celestial Peak restaurant. She had discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed, had found partnership that enriched rather than diminished her independence, and had created work that honored her father's memory while helping others avoid his fate. The Foundation's conference room held framed photographs of all 23 destroyed businesses, memorial portraits that served as daily reminders of why their work mattered. Richard Sinclair's picture held the place of honor at the center of the display, surrounded by images of other business owners who had built their companies through honest work and lost them to systematic evil. But the conference room also displayed photographs of reconstruction and renewal. Companies rebuilt with Foundation assistance, families reunited after years of financial devastation, children who could attend college because their parents destroyed businesses had been restored through legal action and compensation funds. The story that had begun with humiliation and powerlessness had evolved into something larger than personal revenge. It had become proof that systematic evil could be met with systematic good, that victims weren't powerless when they organized effectively and fought back with intelligence and determination. Walking through downtown Denver toward their car, Ava and Nikolai passed the building where her father's engineering firm had once occupied 3 floors of office space. A new company had taken over the lease, their sign advertising environmental consulting services that honored the same values of honest work and community service that had defined Richard Sinclair's career. The site no longer filled Ava with grief and rage. Instead, it served as a reminder that good work continues, that the destruction of individual businesses doesn't end the demand for integrity and expertise in the marketplace. Her father's legacy lived on through the Foundation, through the families they had helped rebuild their lives, and through the legal precedents that would make similar conspiracies harder to execute in the future. As they reached their car, Nikolai paused to take her hand, his thumb stroking across the wedding ring that marked their partnership in both business and life. The gesture was small but meaningful, a daily acknowledgement of the connection that had survived separation, grown stronger through shared struggle, and evolved into something that would last for whatever challenges lay ahead. "Do you think your father would be proud of what we've built?" he asked, the question emerging with the kind of vulnerability that had become natural between them after months of working together through difficult emotional territory. Ava considered the question seriously, thinking about the man who had raised her to believe that honest work and integrity mattered more than wealth or status. The Foundation represented everything he had valued, using success to help others, fighting against injustice through legal channels, building something that would outlast individual accomplishments. "I think he would be amazed," she said finally. He always believed that good people could make a difference if they worked together and refused to give up. The Foundation proves he was right. Their drive home took them past the Grand Hyatt, where the charity gala that had served as the stage for exposing the conspiracy had taken place 6 months earlier. The hotel's marquee advertised another charity event, another gathering of wealthy donors attempting to balance their privilege with philanthropy. Ava no longer felt anger when she saw displays of wealth and status. The Foundation's work had taught her that most successful people were genuinely committed to using their resources responsibly, that the Blackwood conspiracy represented an aberration rather than the norm among business leaders. But she also understood now that good intentions weren't sufficient protection against systematic evil, that honest people needed legal support and organized advocacy to defend themselves against predatory tactics. The Foundation's existence served as both shield and sword, protecting vulnerable businesses while actively pursuing justice for those who had already been targeted. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the kitchen of their shared apartment, Ava felt gratitude for the life they had built from the ashes of destruction and betrayal. The work was difficult, but it was meaningful. The relationship was complex, but it was genuine. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape together. The Foundation had cases pending in 12 states, evidence of systematic business destruction that extended far beyond the Blackwood conspiracy. Each case represented families struggling to understand why their honest work and careful planning hadn't protected them from forces they had never imagined could exist. But each case also represented hope, proof that victims could fight back effectively when they had proper support and legal advocacy. The Foundation's success rate was approaching 90% for cases where clear evidence of systematic fraud existed, with recovered assets averaging $2.3 million per family. Most importantly, their work was creating systemic change that extended beyond individual victim compensation. Federal agencies were developing new protocols for investigating business fraud. Legal aid organizations were sharing the Foundation's tactical approaches, and business schools were teaching case studies based on the Blackwood conspiracy to help future entrepreneurs recognize and defend against predatory acquisition tactics. As they settled on their sofa after dinner, reviewing case files for the following day's work, Ava realized that her father's death had led to something he could never have imagined. Not just justice for his own destruction, but systematic protection for thousands of other families who would never face the same coordinated evil because of the legal precedents and advocacy networks that had emerged from his tragedy. The Foundation's work would continue long after she and Nikolai retired, carried forward by other victims who had found strength through organization and other advocates who understood that economic justice required active defense against systematic predation. Her father's story had become the foundation for protecting countless other fathers from experiencing the same systematic destruction. That was justice in its truest form. Not just punishment for past evil, but prevention of future harm. Not just compensation for individual victims, but systematic change that protected entire communities from experiencing similar devastation. Looking back on that night at the Celestial Peak restaurant, Ava sometimes marveled at how quickly her life had transformed from survival to purpose, from powerlessness to advocacy, from isolation to partnership. But more often, she felt gratitude for the strength she had discovered within herself and the allies she had found in unexpected places. The Foundation's motto, engraved on a plaque in their conference room, came from something her father had written in his final letter to her. Good work continues, even when individual workers fall. Evil prospers only when good people refuse to organize and fight back. Those words had become not just memorial to her father's values, but operational philosophy for everything she and Nikolai had built together. The Foundation would continue fighting systematic evil with systematic good, one family at a time, until the legal system evolved enough that such conspiracies became impossible to sustain. What about you? Have you ever felt like the system was rigged against ordinary people trying to build honest lives? Have you seen powerful interests destroy small businesses or family dreams just because they could? Stories like Ava's remind us that justice is possible when victims find the courage to organize and fight back. But it requires all of us to believe that good work and integrity still matter more than wealth and connections. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And remember that every voice raised against systematic injustice makes it harder for the powerful to prey on the vulnerable.